yeah, let's give the recommendations now, at least some of them. So, based on everything I've said, I hope it's become clear why I would say there's like a 3 phases to this, how to deal with this, how to resolve, because it's not curing, as I said, you can't go back to the bad life, but how to resolve the symptoms. As I said, I don't like the common recommendation, and I don't like the keto intermittent fasting recommendation overall because of the limitations that they have and the fact that they may not suit everyone. But if either of those things suit you, enjoy. The thing that I enjoy more is the other option, which is to, okay, so let's talk about food is one thing. Just keeping insulin low or medium is another thing. So not letting it get high. Not letting insulin get high is another thing. And then lowering stress chemicals to a balanced level and not an excessive level is the third thing. Because any of those 3 things can throw it off, right? Go too long without eating anything, that can trigger the whole roller coaster. Insulin goes too high, that can trigger the roller coaster. Stress chemicals go too high, that can trigger the roller coaster. Dealing with any one of those 3 can be enough to make you feel better, but dealing with all 3 of those will guarantee you feeling better, from my understanding and experience. So, food is really, really big. The great thing about this to me is I didn't understand a lot of what I've been teaching in these videos back when I used to give this advice to people 10 years ago. But the advice still stands. So that's great. I found that's often the case with when I used to teach stuff is I didn't fully understand why it was a good idea. I just knew it was, and sure enough. Okay, so what am I talking about? My belief is that a balance of macronutrients in a proportion that suits you every meal is ideal. What are the macronutrients? They are protein, carbohydrate, and fat. We might get into more detail about exactly why we do it that way in the next episode. But in a nutshell, we talked about why you want to have some carbohydrates, right? If there's no carbohydrates, your body has to use stress to make them or release them from storage. So there has to be some carbohydrates. Why does there have to be any protein? First of all, because your body needs protein. It's the building block for a lot of your body. Second of all, it will reduce the speed at which the carbohydrates are taken up, which is really a key thing. And then fat. What's the benefit of fat? So it is a lot like, this is like blood sugar 101. A lot of people have heard of glycemic index and glycemic load, right? So what's the glycemic index? Glycemic index is basically a measurement of how fast will this turn into glucose and get into my bloodstream. So some things that are already, sugars that are really broken down, often starches actually are the biggest culprits for this. White rice and baked potato are like classic examples. They have the highest glycemic index because even though they're very long chains of sugar, they're very long chains of simple sugar. It's just glucose, 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 forming a starch. And the body can very quickly turn that into just glucose. With other things, there's other sugars. There's sucrose, there's fructose, there's mannose, there's lactose. There's other things, and they break down more slowly. And then you have the long chains of carbohydrates, which break down slower still. And once the chains of carbohydrates get really big, that's called fiber. And so they are so big and so long that often your body can't break them down at all, which is why they're a fiber. They're something that feeds the organisms in you, in the case of soluble fiber, or just moves right through you, kind of acts like a brush in the case of insoluble fiber. But all of that's ultimately carbohydrate, right? And that's why sometimes you see on nutritional labels, it will say like carbohydrates, 10, out of which 6 sugars and 4 fiber, something like that. So the glycemic index is how quickly it gets into the sugar in your bloodstream. The glycemic load is that times how much there is, which is an important thing, because when people heard about the glycemic index, they were like, well, I can't have like, I don't know, a teaspoon of honey because it's high in the glycemic index, but I can have like a whole bowl full of, I don't know, beans because they're low on the glycemic index. And it's like, it's not quite as simple as that, because even though beans break down a lot more slowly into glucose, there's a lot, if you have a lot more of them, there's still a lot of glucose overall, and then it's still quite a lot of glucose per period of time that it's broken down. So that's the glycemic load. It's amount of it times where it is in the index. Does that make sense?
I understand the glycemic index pretty well. It's just the load. Yeah, that's kind of escaping me a little bit.
Okay, so something of a so if you understand glycemic index, something of a glycemic index of 100 would have the same impact ultimately on your blood sugar. 10 grams of it would have the same impact on your blood sugar as 20 grams of something of glycemic index of 50.
Yeah, understand.
So that's the glycemic load.
Okay.
It's amount of it times what the glycemic index is.
Got it. Okay.
Okay. So we want to be aware of that glycemic load. We want to have some carbohydrates, like I talked about, but we don't want the glycemic load to be too high. If it's very low glycemic index, then we can have more carbs. If it's very high glycemic index, then we can have less carbs. Generally recommended, have low glycemic index, have more, but still be aware not to have a crazy amount, right? How much should you have? It really depends on you, and genetics are a big part here. We have our carbohydrate report, one of the other ones that we have in our blood sugar collection. Some people are more farmer genes, meaning that they've kind of adapted to agriculture. Yeah, like you, Chrissy. They've adapted to the agricultural age where human beings started growing a lot of grains and other carbs. Some people are more hunter-gatherer genealogy, where they really haven't adapted to that abundance of starch, especially. They may have adapted to fruits to some degree because they've been available for a lot longer in significant quantities, but even that, tends to be seasonal. So they're more adapted to a lot of protein and fat. They tend to do better on that kind of diet, the hunter-gatherers. And that's one of the other reasons why you might feel better on that ketosis or not. If you're that hunter-gatherer type, you'll do better on a ketogenic diet, probably. That's probably the biggest predictor of that, is that genetic report, I would say. Because the genetics really are the key factor rather than the, lifestyle. And so, you want to have a decent glycemic load of carbohydrate. You want to have a decent amount of protein just to meet your requirements. And you want to have a decent amount of fat. Why? Fat reduces the glycemic index. So this gets a little bit complicated again. But basically, people act as if, I don't know, whatever the food, dates, rice, potatoes, that they have this glycemic index no matter what. But the reality is, if you have any of the things I just said with a load of butter or a load of cream or a load of vegetable oil or nuts or whatever, the glycemic index is going to be way, way, way lower, because the glycemic index is how quickly does the glucose get into the bloodstream, and the fat will massively, depending on the amount, but not that much fat is required to massively slow down how quickly that fat gets into the bloodstream. So that's the glycemic index. The other thing that slows the glucose getting into the bloodstream too quickly is fiber. This is one of the justifications for a high fiber diet, which makes sense. Is a high fiber diet always a good thing? No. If people have excess of, especially pathogenic, but even any organisms in their intestinal tract, then they feed on fiber and they can create more gas, and this can create more endotoxin, more inflammation. This is a controversial area that I won't dig into too deeply today, but fiber is not always good. I think I talked about it in the digestion episode, but it is good for blood sugar. So you want some fiber and you want some fat. For me, I like to have 20% of calories coming from protein, 40% from fat, 40% from carbs, something like that. If I have too much coming from fat, I notice I feel hypoglycemic pretty much straight away, for the reason I said earlier, because there's insulin being released without any carbs, which is lowering blood sugar even more. If I do the opposite, if I have large amounts of carbs and not enough fat, then I will feel hypoglycemic before I get really hungry. So maybe 3, 4, 5 hours after a meal, I'm not really grumbling in my belly hungry yet, but my energy's starting to get low because I've had a bit of a spike, because I had too much of a glycemic load. When I have more fat, it prevents that. I say that not to talk about myself, but to see what you relate to, right? If you relate more to having a crash as soon as you eat, then I would suggest adding more carbs. If you have more of a crash too soon after you eat, 2, 3, 4, 5 hours after you eat, then I would say that is often due to too many carbs. So that's how I would try and find the right balance. The type of fat you use is important. I'm a huge fan of coconut oil, and especially MCT oil, because it has this instant energy that your body can use for fuel that doesn't require the same amount of processing. And in the case of MCT, which does exist to some degree in coconut oil anyway, that's where it comes from, it also has ketones. So it literally gives your brain instant fuel as well. So it's the main type of fat I consume now. I will say I avoided this for years despite hearing how good it was in theory, because I don't like the smell of coconut. But I started to get odorless organic coconut oil. And so there's no smell to it, there's no taste to it. I actually found out those things that cause the smell are like certain chemicals that actually are not 100% good anyway. So I think for me, it was something that wasn't agreeing with me. I didn't want it. So I'm just saying, if you hear that recommendation and go, oh, I've heard that before, oh, I don't like it, try that. Try having the odorless type. It's not extra virgin or whatever, which is what people think is what they want. But actually, to me, it's way, way better. Tip with MCT oil as well, which I'd actually be... when I first tried MCT oil, it was like on its own, and often it would, burn my throat, give me gastrointestinal disturbance, even make me feel kind of dizzy, all stuff I'd heard from other people before. Then I started having it, and it was just totally fine. I quickly upped it, and now I have like several tablespoons a day. And then I saw this post recently of someone saying, God, if I had that, I would be on the toilet all day. I was like, yeah, why doesn't that happen to me? Is it just because I'm used to it? And then I saw a nutritionist say that if you have MCT oil heated up along with liquids, for some reason it doesn't have any of that negative effect. And I realized that's actually how I always do it. I always have it in blended, or not blended, but soup. I always have it in soup. So it's always warm and with liquid. And so that's a tip for MCT oil. Again, if you've tried it, don't like it, disagreed with you. And I think, the original recommendation for MCT oil was with coffee, right? So again, with a hot liquid. But I prefer to have it with food. And that's how I do it, with hot liquid. Liquid, even a sauce, you can add it to pasta, curry, whatever, something like that. Okay, so diet. The combination of those macronutrients, as I just said. You must eat within an hour of waking up if you have hypoglycemia. To me, this is non-negotiable. Now, have I just admitted earlier there is a completely opposite way of looking at this, which is valid? Yes. Right? So if you don't have an issue with stress chemicals, particularly, then can you intermittent fast? Can you skip breakfast? Sure. To be honest, I still don't know why you would, because I think the correct meal to skip if you want to lose weight, which is what most people do when they're intermittent fasting, is dinner. There is definitely a lot of evidence that skipping dinner is better, but a lot of people kind of poo-poo that. I would at least say there is no evidence that that breakfast is better than skipping dinner. So you can either believe it makes no difference, or that skipping dinner is better. There's no evidence that skipping breakfast is ever better. I think when people skip breakfast, again, sometimes it's valid. Some people genuinely have a tendency for low stress chemicals. And that's actually overseen partly by this COMT gene, which we talked about before. The COMT gene is the one that breaks down stress chemicals. If you're COMT fast, if you have a tendency to break down stress chemicals fast, you'll probably love intermittent fasting in the morning, and you'll probably love having a big coffee in the morning with MCT oil, because you don't have an issue with too much stress chemicals. You have an issue with not enough stress chemicals a lot of the time, at least in terms of how you feel. So I can understand, right? But if that works for you, I've already said that, then it works for you. But I'm talking to all the people it doesn't work for. And in that case, I would say you want to eat within an hour of waking up. Try it. if the other systems haven't worked for you. Now, here's the thing. You're not going to want to try it. Everyone with hypoglycemia doesn't have appetite in the morning. It's pretty much like a universal rule. At the very least, some people still will because they're doing very physically demanding things, because they got very good digestion. But at the very least, you won't have as much appetite. And if it's really bad, not only will you not have appetite, you might well have nausea in the morning. Where does that come from? It comes from an excess of stress chemicals, again. And actually, all of them do that, even dopamine. Even though dopamine is the chemical of desire, it doesn't, funnily enough, really lead to a desire for food specifically. And that's why when people really have high dopamine because of drugs, it almost always kills appetite. So all the stress chemicals reduce appetite. So the time when you're most likely to have blood sugar so low that your body is producing a lot of stress chemicals to cope with it is when you first wake up. Because you likely haven't eaten at least before you went to sleep. Many people haven't eaten for a lot longer than that still, right? Maybe they ate at 6 p.m., they went to bed at 10 p.m., they're now waking up at 6 a.m. So it's been 12 hours without any food, right? The longest you've been without food is almost certainly when you wake up. Maybe you want to go for longer without it if you really want to increase your stress chemicals. But if you don't want to increase your stress chemicals, then eating as soon as possible in the way I described is good. From my anecdotal experience, what I've seen over and over and over again with many, many clients is, because they often resist this, I often have to tell them again and again and again, when they finally did it, their blood sugar issues went away. I would say the breakfast is the most important meal of the day by far. There's also this issue that I've observed anecdotally, which is once your blood sugar is off, once it's on this roller coaster, it's pretty much impossible to fix it. You can follow all the rest of the advice, and if you skip breakfast, it won't work. You're already screwed. The only thing you can do, go to sleep, wake up again the next morning, try again, pretty much.
Reset.
Yeah. And of course, if you keep doing that, it'll keep getting worse very gradually over time. But yeah, so once your blood sugar is low, it's very, very important to get it into perfect balance. But when you first wake up, you have that opportunity to keep it in perfect balance by eating ASAP. A balance of all the nutrients. People often ask, by the way, oh, and those so complicated macronutrients, blah, 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 blah. I didn't follow most of that. What do I actually eat? Do I eat cereal or whatever they say, right? And I always say this, what did you have for dinner? And they always tell me some proper meal. You know, very, very few people say anything like cereal or cookies or donuts or fruits or whatever. They'll say, you know, I had some kind of protein, you know, fish or dairy or meat or maybe beans, right? Soy. I had some kind of carbs and I had some kind of fat. That's always what's in an evening meal. You know, pizza, curry, steak and chips. I mean, I don't know. What do people eat? You name it. No matter what, any evening meal you can present to me, I can say, yes, that is a combination of all three macronutrients in a reasonable balance. So why people make this difficult, I don't know. They don't want to have that in the morning. I always just eat a normal meal for breakfast. I have done that for well over a decade. You know, I hate it when you're in the Western world and you go to hotels and stuff and they just have like nothing out. And this is not something that affects the rest of the world from what I've seen. Every time I've been anywhere in Asia or anywhere in Africa counts, but the Middle East, they always just have a normal meal for breakfast available. That's they have like a large selection. And I don't know, maybe it's I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's culture or whatever, but it's a good idea, right? To have that balance. Now, having said that, in our cultures, we do have, you know, examples of that for breakfast. The traditional English breakfast you might have heard of, right? And bacon and eggs and beans and sausages and mushrooms and tomatoes and hash browns or something like that, right? That's all free. Is it the healthiest version? No, but it will balance your blood sugar. And it might be healthy if it's all organic and well sourced and all the rest of it. So I know that practical question's coming, so I'll just answer that.
All right, Elwin. Okay, so that's breakfast covered. So what about the rest of the meals of the day? I mean, like, you know, because there's a whole gamut of stuff. Like, eating frequent. There's some people that don't like eating frequently. There's some people that like spacing it out. I mean, I've played around with both. Then also for me too, it's like trying to find the protein source, because sometimes I don't always want to eat meat, but I don't always want to eat egg white, and I'm trying to stay away from dairy at times as well. So talk to me.
Protein is tricky. You want to at least get some proteins with your food, but that doesn't always mean animal. Doesn't always mean meat and fish or eggs, as you say. It can mean dairy. That's another example, still animal-ish. And it can even mean, seeds especially tend to be high-ish in protein. Pulses, which means beans and lentils and stuff like that. So beans and pulses at their best tend to be like 1 part protein to 2 part carbs. So you're probably not going to want to have beans with loads of carbs like rice or, corn chips or something like that. But certainly if it's mainly beans as your source of carb and protein, then that could potentially work. Ditto seeds have a lot of fat in relation to protein. Probably one of the best in that regard is hemp seed. It's got quite a lot of protein compared to fat. But still, you certainly wouldn't want to have any other fat if you wanted to keep those two balanced. But it is trickier to do it plant-based to get enough protein. Everyone who's into plant protein will disagree with that. They'll talk about how the human need for protein is actually fairly small. I know it's quite a contentious issue. I'm not going to argue about the pure need for protein, but I'm talking about it from this blood sugar balancing point of view. And you do actually see certainly not a lower incidence of pre-diabetes, insulin resistance, and even diabetes in vegetarian or vegan people. And in fact, the culture in the world is probably the most strongly plant-based, or at least non-meat-based, would be India. And you certainly see a lot of people with issues with blood sugar there, despite not eating any animal foods. So plant foods, or exclusively plant foods, there's no protection of it. So anyway, with protein, assuming you're not, vegan, the other option is just to vary them, Chrissy. So I'm happy to have the same thing every meal, but I know a lot of people prefer some variety, and that's absolutely great. And then, so get the variety, right? So in one meal have cheese, and another meal have shellfish, and another meal have red meat, another meal have white meat. There's loads of variation within that as well. And you might end up in a rhythm there that you're comfortable with, right? You might like eggs in the morning, you might like chicken or fish during the day, and you might like more like a steak or something like that at night, for instance, right? So it might be something like that works for you as well. Hey, I hope you enjoyed that clip from the Rejuvenate podcast. If you want to watch the full episode that came from, just click on the link above. Or if you just want to watch our latest video, then click the link below, and make sure that you subscribe to the channel and like the video. Thank you.